time, well, thank you, Roy. Thank you again. At this time, I'd like to invite Mr. David Burg to the podium. As he makes his way to the podium. If I may, I'd like to ask our audience member. In the meantime, I would like to ask our audience members to turn all cell phones to silent as the symposium begins. David Burg will present results from the 2011 Global State of Security Information Survey. David is the leader of PwC's Forensic Technology Solutions practice. He assists clients in reactive and proactive consulting capacities involving the deployment of information technology solutions and their use. Please join me in welcoming David Burg.
All right, good morning, everyone. Apologize for the slight delay there. While we were waiting for the slides to come up, I was able to quickly memorize all of your faces, and I've matched your faces to a database that I had at my disposal, so I know where you work, I know how old you are, I know how many children you have, I know where you live. I'm kidding, of course, but imagine if I did have that capability, how you would feel right about now. Listen, I have the great honor and the privilege of presenting to you this morning. I really do appreciate this opportunity. And I've got a lot of, I think, interesting information that I'd like to share with you that is driven by a survey that PwC performed in conjunction with CIO and CSO magazine this year. As the Dean mentioned, my name again is David Burg. I'm based here in Washington, D.C. I'm with PricewaterhouseCoopers, also known now as simply PwC. We have a very large information security and consulting capacity here in the United States and around the world. And it's through our capacity in this space that we have developed significant contacts with clients that responded to our survey, which I'll walk you through here this morning. As you can see on the title of the slide here, Eye of the Storm. This year's survey uses the hurricane analogy to summarize our findings, and we chose this analogy for a variety of reasons. Number one, predicting where a hurricane will go is obviously a very difficult science. It's not precise, as you know from the models that are projected on the news when hurricanes approach. There are many different paths that the hurricane can follow. In fact, it's not until the hurricane actually arrives that the true destination is known. We also choose the eye of the hurricane as the analogy because when sitting in the eye of the hurricane, one can look up at the sky and see sunny skies and perhaps misinterpret the sun as the end of the turmoil. And we know that in fact that if you're sitting stationary in the eye of the hurricane, eventually the other side of the hurricane will strike and various damage will ensue. Furthermore, in the final piece of the analogy, final two pieces of the analogy, is that hurricanes in the northern hemisphere spin counterclockwise, and so what you will see from many of the findings that are contained within our survey, many of the results that we're going to report to you this year are in fact counterintuitive. And last, the damage from a hurricane, it really just depends on where you are in relationship to the hurricane, which is, I think you'll see manifest in the data from our survey. So let me get into it here, and we can advance. As I mentioned in the outset, a hurricane is very, very difficult to predict, and the same is true for the various types of risks that we all face from a security or from a security perspective. And I think one of the key takeaways that hopefully at the end of this presentation you'll remember is that all of much of the lessons that are learned and the information that comes through from our survey analysis reveals that preparation for a hurricane regardless of where you're oriented, is very, very important. And I think the other really important lesson is being very honest in terms of self-critique related to your true state of capability, your state of security, and where you care to take your security program. If we go to the next slide here. So continuing the storm/hurricane analogy here, while we all know that the tumultuous times of economic turmoil in 2008/9 have passed, we all know today that we face continued significant economic challenges in the United States, in Europe, and in other parts of the world. And what's interesting is that the economic crises have a direct impact on the state of security in corporations and in government organizations all around the world. Because obviously when economic pressures are on, we have to rationalize decisions around spend and make choices about where to spend our time and expend efforts. And so what you'll see through the survey results is the fact that through economic crises, we globally have made choices that are reflected in the data that show that there's a lag in terms of economic crisis and then the impact on security spending and security capability. The other interesting element, of course, is that with tight economic times come opportunities to take out costs, and so I think one of the reasons we see significant adoption of various low-cost IT operational choices such as cloud is in fact driven by the fact that we just have less money to spend, and also there's an awful lot of hype around the use and deployment of cloud. And so I will speak about perceptions of our survey respondents with respect to cloud later on in the survey. Many of our respondents to the survey say that they have both a strategy and that they are executing their strategy. But I think one question for all of you to think about, if you roll back and listen to Dean Haddock's comments, and we start to think about all of the various threats that we face today, and you juxtapose them to your existing security strategy or your execution, you have to ask yourself whether or not your security strategy really aligns correctly with the risks. And I will talk specifically about some of the risks, but certainly do want to just make sure that everyone is mindful of the evolution of called the cyber risk continuum, beginning with just simple computer intrusion type attacks that have been going on for many years. Criminal enterprise, where you have very sophisticated and organized either individuals or organizations that are particularly targeting certain types of sensitive information, including personally identifiable information, PCI and PHI data. Now we see the emergence of the nation-state attack. I think it's highly likely that General Hayden will spend quite a bit of time talking about nation-state attack and the seriousness of it. I can tell you, even from a PwC perspective, we see a significant amount of concern around this type of attack in our commercial clients, and have seen significant concern and have been responding to events in this area for years. Then, of course, the newest phenomenon is just hacktivism, where you have groups like Anonymous that are very well organized. They utilize social networking and IRC chat rooms to communicate, coordinate, and then focus their attacks, some of which the Dean mentioned in his opening statements. And so really the reality is that the threat landscape continues to evolve. This is not a lecture about fear, uncertainty, and doubt. These are very real risks that we strongly encourage you and your respective organization to be mindful of. And so, as I just mentioned, while the economic storms of 2008 have passed, all is not in order. Without a doubt, the frequency of security events are up. And interestingly, and I think this is one of the counterintuitive pieces, the capital and operating expenditures that should be devoted to enhancing security capabilities and security programs and security processes are in fact are being deferred. And what you will see and what you will hear later in my presentation are some very interesting geographic trends around very concerning negative trends around security program performance. I think the other important element to mention here in terms of the security event frequency and the seriousness of the attacks, just to keep in mind really the asymmetry that we face here, where you can have very few individuals with very little resources inflicting very large damage to organizations and to commercial enterprises. Furthermore, you have to also keep in mind that the ability to investigate these attacks is very, very challenging, because we see sort of a counter-opposing force between IT operational needs to keep systems up and running, to really limit the amount of information that's stored in an enterprise, particularly related to very important investigative artifacts like log files and such. And of course, the investigative needs, which are completely the opposite. You want as much information as possible from as many different sources as possible, so you can try to figure out what the heck happened and how it happened and who did it. Furthermore, I think it is important to mention examples of attacks on critical infrastructure, just because you really have to anticipate what will likely happen at some point in the future. And what I'm referring to, of course, is Stuxnet is a wonderful example of a very, very sophisticated program that was targeted to operate critical control systems in a nuclear facility, and at the same time we're able to create the facade of normalcy for the system operators. And so the concern is, if that code makes its way into the wild, will it be able to be adapted or modified and deployed in other territories around the world? Furthermore, I think we also have to think about some of the very sophisticated attacks that occurred in 2010 and also in 2011 around core authentication technologies and the impact of those technologies being breached, and then their application to enable attackers really in any industry, public and private sector, all around the world. So the frequency certainly up, the seriousness of the attacks are increasing. And again, I think, as you will hear in just a few minutes here, that our survey results are not necessarily encouraging. Let me walk you through what I'm going to cover with you today. Number one, I want to walk you through the methodology of our survey so you can understand the basis of the analysis. I'm going to talk to you about self-described frontrunners and dive into self-defined frontrunners' perceptions of their security capabilities. We'll talk a bit about the levels of confidence in security programs and progress over time. I'm going to talk to you about trends around vulnerability and perceptions of exposure, where we're seeing some opportunities for windows of improvement or areas for improvement. Definitely want to talk to you about the global trends. I think you'll be very surprised when you hear how various developed portions of the world are trending from a security preparedness perspective. And then I'm just going to spend a little bit of time, we're going to talk about the true leaders that emerge through our survey so that you can learn from the characteristics of the leaders to help your respective organization. As I mentioned at the outset, this our 2012 Global State of Information Security Survey is performed worldwide by PwC in conjunction with CIO and CSO magazines, and it was conducted in the spring of 2011. It is important to mention here that this is the 14th year that we've performed this survey. It's the 9th year consecutively that we've performed the survey in conjunction with CIO and CSO magazines. We surveyed our clients from 138 countries around the world. We had greater than 96,000 responses, 9,600 responses. And we didn't just survey technical individuals or analysts and such, but we surveyed a wide range of functional areas, all the way ranging from CEOs to CFOs, CIOs, CSOs, and various other directors of security, and of course, certain personnel in security operations. I'll give you a breakout of that, of the response in a moment. They were surveyed on greater than 40 questions related to information security and privacy safeguards and their respective alignment with the business. You will see that about a third of the respondents came from companies with revenues of greater than $500 million. And then we had very good geographic coverage. As you can hopefully see from this pie chart slide up here, the pie chart in the upper left-hand corner shows you the geographic distribution of our respondents. So about 29% came from North America, 21% from South America, 26% from Europe, 20% from Asia, and the balance, the 3% came from the Middle East and South Africa. So very good and really equivalent global coverage. We didn't have a North American bias in the survey. Moving over to the right, the upper right-hand circle shows you the delineation of the respondents by their respective functional areas. And so what you see, interestingly, is about 20% of the respondents held the title of CEO, CFO, or Chief Operating Officer. About 15% of the respondents led a security organization or a technology organization. So we have CISOs, CSOs, CIOs, and Chief Technology Officers. We have about 23% from technology and security management, about 12% from compliance, risk, and privacy, and then the balance, the remaining 30%, we really call them core technology and security operational staff. And then the bottom pie chart here shows you the distribution of the respondents by their respective company size. And so starting at the top, we had about 23% had revenues of greater than $1 billion, about 20% between $100 million and $1 billion, and then about 37% less than $100 million. For this audience here in Washington, D.C., about 6% were nonprofit or government / educational. Interestingly, 13% of the respondents indicated they did not know the size of their organization. I found that humorous as well. Moving on, we surveyed companies across really all industries, and so what you can see here are the number of respondents this year across all the various industry sectors. The highest percentage were in technology and financial services, and you can see basically moving down the slide here, good representation across really all industry groups. What's important about this is that, and I'll come to this at the end of the presentation, is that you have the ability to utilize this survey for your purposes, and so you can slice and dice the data, and we can help you do that if you'd like, but to refine the answers based on the respective industry. Because while the results that I'm summarizing are going to be at a high level across all industry groups, there are very interesting nuance and difference in various industry groups, as you can imagine. What we asked our respondents to do is to categorize themselves into one of 4 different buckets. A front runner would be described as someone who has an effective security strategy and is proactively executing their strategic vision or their strategic plan. A strategist is someone that defines themselves as being better at getting the strategy right than the execution. A tactician is someone who's good at getting something done rather than having an effective strategy. And a firefighter is one that neither has an effective strategy nor an effective execution capability. And I guess before I show you the self-proclaimed results, just by show of hands, how many of you would expect to see that we would see a normal distribution in the responses to this self-classification? So for those of you that think we'd see normal distribution, which is a bell-shaped curve, raise your hand. One person? Only one person in this entire audience. Okay, well that one person is wrong. Sorry. And what you can see here is, I think, a perfect demonstration of something known as optimism bias. Optimism bias is a belief that the future will be better than the past and the present. And it's a very common phenomenon that we see in human behavior. We see this type of behavior in terms of people's self-perception of the success of their respective marriage. We see it in terms of people's projected exam scores. We see it in financial projections. We see it in self-evaluations of one's own health. We also see it in terms of the way that our respondents believe their security capabilities will manifest, which is interesting. And so 43% of our respondents describe themselves as frontrunners. And again, these are individuals or companies that have an effective strategy and an effective execution ability. And then you can see 27% strategists, 15% tacticians, 14% firefighters. I will reveal to you at the end of this presentation, or towards the end of the presentation, the actual percentage of frontrunners based on our analysis of the data. And I will tell you, well, I will ask you to consider whether you think it's greater or less than the 43%. Okay? So let's start to break down some of the elements of the frontrunners. And this question here asks the respondents to describe the factors that are driving spend in the area of information security. Or in other words, describe the justification for the spend. And what's interesting is the frontrunners describe themselves as appearing more proactive and strategic. They view themselves as being more aligned with the strategy of the respective business. And you can see from the results here that if you look at the columns from left to right, the front runners describe, or 50% of the front runners describe that their client requirements are the principal element that really drives their spend. In other words, again, they view themselves as being very closely aligned with understanding what the business needs are, and then they justify spend in the area of security to meet those needs. And if you look, at the other non-front runner categories, what you see is that there's a trend toward being much more reactive around spend. So you see the strategists have their highest response rates around being motivated by legal and regulatory requirements. Same holds true for the tacticians. And the firefighters really seem to be pretty much across the board. So they don't really seem to have a very clear direction. And they are, as a firefighter would indicate, they're highly reactive. Front runners also felt a very strong need to ensure that the company had extensive disaster recovery and business continuity planning and execution capability. And again, I want to just emphasize the data points to the front runners feeling a very strong strategic connection to the business. Let's talk a little bit about what motivated the respondents, or how they describe their commitment to information protection. And what we found in the results here is that the front runners felt a very close connection, again, to business strategy and the related risks. And you can see that manifest in the data. based on the fact that there's a high level of commitment to protecting all different types of data across the organization. So about, on average, 62% of the frontrunners responded that they were very passionate about protecting either customer information, financial data, intellectual property or trade secret information, corporate information, or employee information. So their percentage is far higher than the other groups. If you move down over to the right, the firefighters come out as averaging only 35% across all those categories. That's a 75% difference in the sentiment around commitment to information protection when you compare the front runners to the firefighters on the other end of the spectrum. However, this question focused on, has your company deferred security initiatives? And interestingly, all four of the groups remain overall reluctant to spend money on information security programs. Interestingly, though, and maybe this is one of the other counterintuitive results, the strategists are more likely to clamp down on funding than any other group. And I say that's counterintuitive because one would think that the firefighters would likely be more likely to clamp down on spending, but they're not. What's the explanation? Well, front runners have a greater ability to report financial losses, and so they have maybe a better appreciation of the connection between the spend on security programs and the impact. Firefighters are typically, they turn out to be much smaller organizations, and so they are more fiscally constrained. The tacticians don't have a strategy, and so they really don't have an insight into why the funding is important or the connection to the funding. And so the strategists, they lack a sustained focus mechanism, and so they're more likely to vary their effort year over year. There's a much more volatile willingness to spend money in terms of both capital and operating expenses. And so, again, we're seeing some stratification in terms of the amount of spend year over year by these self-described groups, really over the last decade with a focus on the past 6 years. Now, we asked a question. We asked respondents to describe their level of confidence in their information security program. And interestingly, and maybe this is an area for optimism, 72% of the respondents indicated they were either very confident or they were somewhat confident in their information security program. So maybe that's good news. Now, the reality is if you take the inverse, that means about a third, or 28%, are not confident in their security program. Let's drill into this a little bit more. One of the ways to measure confidence is transparency, or ability to understand when a breach occurs, how it occurs, what systems are affected, what data is affected, what customers are affected, so on and so forth. And so what we do see here is a positive trend over the last 6 years. And in this particular graph, where the percentage is decreased, that's a good thing, because the question here is, do you not know the answer to the respective questions? How many incidents occurred in the past 12 months? What type of incident occurred, and what was the source of the incident? So what you can see over time, where we're going here from 2007 to 2011, is that the respondents across the board are drawing those numbers down. We believe that the reason we're seeing this particular trend is that this is the result of investment in prevention, detection, and web-related security technologies. So again, what we see here is a positive trend towards an increase in transparency into the various the nature, the source, and the type of incidents that have occurred across the board. However, despite the tight budgets that I talked a little bit earlier about. We also do see organizations adopting certain types of safeguards. And I would be surprised if you'd be able to read this slide in the histogram. So let me walk you through it again. This is actually a slide that shows a positive trend in terms of respondents' implementation of the following technologies. So we see comparing 2010, just last year, this year's survey, 15% increase in malicious code detection tools, 10% increase in intrusion detection tools, 21% increase in intrusion prevention tools, 15% increase in web content filters, 16% increase in the use of secure browsers, and 12% increase in web services security. And so the highest percentage change was in the adoption of the malicious code detection. The largest, the highest percentage response is in the adoption of malicious code detection, and the largest percentage change relates to the adoption of intrusion prevention technologies. The following question summarizes a result around perceptions about spend and security over the next 12 months. And so what you can see here is from 2006 to 2011, the histogram shows the answer to respondents' answer to do you anticipate that security spending will increase over the next 12 months? In 2011, barely a majority, 51%, said that they did view an increase in security spending over the next 12 months. But the reality is, when you look across that histogram, you really, there isn't much of a trend here. There's, in fact, a decrease from 2010 to 2011. I think there's an obvious a dip in 2009, which is likely, again, a consequence of the economic turmoil in 2008/2009. So the sentiment here around spend is essentially flat, and it's basically, it's almost 50-50. Okay, I want to move into the next section of the presentation, talk about what we've seen in terms of concerning degradation of security capabilities in the years following 2008. Again, what we're talking about here, this is aggregated across all geographies, all industries, all company sizes or organization sizes here. Now again, as I said earlier, I strongly suspect that General Hayden will talk a bit about the advanced persistent threat and the seriousness of the advanced persistent threat. I'm sure many of you, or most of you, or all of you in the room are familiar with what is described as the advanced persistent threat. And so what we wanted to begin to analyze was whether or not organizations are adopting their security programs, policies, and procedures to accommodate the risks associated with the advanced persistent threat or APT. And so the reality is that very few of our respondents have converted the real threat into action in the organization that's manifested in the data. All of these trends, unfortunately, are negative. I want to review them with you because, again, I don't think you can likely read the histogram, but we saw an 11% decrease comparing last year's survey, 2010 to 2011, around network access control software deployment, an 8% decrease in identity management technology deployment, a 12% decrease in employee security awareness training program, arguably the least expensive of all of these elements that are represented on this slide. We saw a 10% decrease in centralized security information management processes, and penetration testing activity was flat, where 38% of our respondents report they performed penetration tests in the two respective years. So, the biggest or the largest decrease, and again, the least expensive of them, and maybe the lowest hanging fruit, is around the employee security awareness training program. Again, we see a 12% decrease year over year. hard to understand why organizations wouldn't expend more efforts, again, on something that's relatively simple to alert and educate employees around the risks, to be alert for seemingly legitimate email messages that may contain dangerous payload, as well as use of USB devices and a whole host of other simple security recommendations that would help combat these kinds of challenging threats. And the bad news, unfortunately continues because really what we're seeing here, and this is where you can see the economic conditions being a leading indicator in terms of security spend, is that after 3 years of budget constraints, we're seeing significant degradation and just fundamental core security capabilities. So what we're looking at here is an analysis of the safeguards that organizations have in place, comparing results in the dark orange is 2009, the light orange is 2010, and the burgundy is 2011. Seeing again decreases in capabilities, and so going from left to right, 14%. And this is comparing 2009 to 2000. 14% decrease in the deployment of identity management. We're having an identity management strategy, a 26% decrease in business continuity and disaster recovery capability. Here's another surprising one, 10% decrease in personnel background checks, 14% decrease in people dedicated to monitoring employees' use of the internet, 25% decrease in privacy policy review at least annually, and a 25% decrease on an accurate inventory of locations or jurisdictions where data is stored. And, that last one's really interesting when you think about the adoption of cloud technologies. One of the strengths of the cloud technology is the ability to outsource either a service, the infrastructure, or the entire business process or technology process. One of the challenges, though, is you don't necessarily know where your data is stored. So this becomes very complex if you're an international organization and you have things like the EU Data Privacy Directive that mandates that you control and manage information in ways that are very different than here in the United States. And so the fact that our respondents are lessening their focus on their ability to actually inventory where data is stored, whether it's a cloud or non-cloud-based solution, is concerning. Of course, it also makes it very hard to respond to a breach, to be able to describe the nature of a breach if you don't know where your data, or if you don't know where your sensitive data is stored. We asked our respondents to describe the attributes of where they see the source of the incident coming from. And so we see, again, this is comparing 2009 to 2011. We see a 70% increase in our respondents viewing the customer as the source of the compromise, and an 88% increase from a partner or supplier perspective. So, as you think about the increasing interconnection across supply chains and the delegation of authority or information to various business partners, I think it's interesting to see here that even our respondents view partners or suppliers as being an area of threat or risk. Again, I think this is one of the perhaps counterintuitive elements in this study. And I think that the data also, what we would expect you will see over time is a response to this type of information, is an increase in the number of security capabilities and controls to combat these particular perceptions, to enhance the capabilities around controlling insider access to sensitive information, and better delineate responsibilities and risks related to dealing with business partners or suppliers. Moving on here, we asked our respondents to describe the safeguards that they have in place to protect their data. And again, unfortunately, we see poor trends here where many companies are far less prepared to defend their data than in prior years. Again, just comparing results from 2009 to 2011. I'll review the results with you here real quick. 17% decrease in due diligence related to third parties that are responsible for handling personal data. The 17% decrease in the inventory of third parties that are handling data. A 26% decrease in the requirement of third parties to comply with security policies. 14% decrease in having dedicated employees to monitor employee use of the internet, and a 23% decrease in incident response processes to report or handle breaches. Again, a very negative trend. All of this relates to risks around third-party partnerships, business partnerships, and relying on third parties to handle sensitive information. So again, I talked a little bit earlier about the fact that 72% of our respondents were very confident or somewhat confident in their information security program capabilities. But this too, when we look back to where we were some 6 years ago, is another negative trend, where we see a 12 basis point change when you look at the results back in 2006 to 2011. So in all, what we're seeing is really a fair amount of, quite a bit of pessimism on our respondents' perceptions of their security program capabilities over time. Now, we wanted to start to focus, a little bit on the constructive, on the positive, and where there are areas for improvement, where we can start to, learn some lessons from the data. And so, in order to do that, we wanted to ask some questions around, where does the problem lie functionally inside an organization, from a funding perspective inside the organization, or from a technical complexity perspective. And so then what we wanted to do is ask this question and segment it across, really called the C-suite, so CEOs, CFOs, CIOs, and CISOs, to see if there were any interesting patterns that emerged from the data. And so there were. And so this is a question here, where we asked the respondents to define what are the greatest obstacles to effective information security. Now, very interestingly, the way to interpret this data is by the column really going down. So you can see on the far left side are the CEOs, CFOs, CIOs, and CISOs respectively. Interestingly, what you have here is a little bit of a situation where the various functional areas are really all pointing at one another, or doing one of these. And so the trend that emerges from looking at the CEO response is that they view a lack of capital and really pointing to themselves in terms of leadership as being one of the greatest obstacles to effective information security. The CFOs, perhaps not surprisingly, really point to the CEOs, and then they point to having a lack of a strategy. The CIOs point to the fact that there's a lack of vision, a lack of an information security vision. The CISOs echo that sentiment, but they also point to a lack of clarity, or to put it another way, poorly integrated or overly complex technology infrastructure. And so I think there really are four major themes that come from this view. One is, again, leadership's very important. Having a strategic vision is in alignment is extremely important. Having the right level of funding is very important. And dealing with the complexity inside the organization is important. The complexity point's a really challenging one, because I think the reality is today that the complexity of many companies and organizations is increasing. It's increasing because of adoption of new technologies, which I'm going to talk about, and some of the risks of new technologies, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, but also, from a mergers and acquisition perspective, many companies grow by acquisition. They buy another business and they either integrate and consolidate or they don't. And if they don't, then what you're operating is a variety of different platforms, which makes the security challenges potentially much more challenging, or in our experience, in my experience, much more challenging. We wanted to measure our respondents' reaction to the use of things like mobile devices, to BYOD, bring your own devices to work, as well as the use of social media. And what we see here are, while there are new capabilities, we're seeing a generally slow reaction to respond to these new platforms and the risks associated with their use. And so only 43%, which is the left-hand column of the histogram, have a security strategy in place for bring your own device. Only 37% have a strategy in place for mobile devices. Only 32% have a security strategy for the use of social media. And what's striking about these, I'll pick on the social media one for example, or start with is, as we all know, there's an extraordinary adoption of the use of social media technologies and means of communication. Of course, there are various generational differences, but there's really literally an exponential increase in the use of these types of technologies. And also what happens is the technologies certainly are used during normal working hours. And so it's just surprising to us when we look at these low adoption rates that organizations generally are not thinking about these risks. This would be one of the areas of opportunity for you to consider. I talked a little bit earlier, or I talked a number of times about cloud and the adoption of cloud computing. And what's interesting is that our respondents say that they have the perception that there is an increase in security capability associated with the adoption or the use of cloud technologies. However, it's hard to reconcile that fact with responses to certain questions here. And just real quick, in terms of adoption, 41%, so a large chunk of our respondents today say that they use cloud services, and of those, 54% say that the cloud capability has increased their security posture. However, think about that versus the fact that 32% of the respondents indicated that they have an uncertain ability to enforce security policies on their cloud provider. 19% indicate that there's inadequate training in IT auditing, again, of their information in the cloud provider. 15% indicate they have questionable privileged access control at the provider site. 11% are concerned about the proximity of their data to someone else's, and 9% are uncertain about their ability to recover data. I can tell you that I think it would be very important for you, if you're contemplating cloud, to take a look at those elements in the survey, but really focus on your service level agreements. And I can tell you that from a crisis or an investigative perspective, in every case where we've dealt with information that's either hosted by a third party or a cloud provider, it becomes very difficult to have rapid response times to extract the information that's necessary to conduct an investigation, making the investigative capabilities, from my perspective, very, very difficult. Be thoughtful as you tread into the area of cloud. I'm going to move on now, and I think this is one of the really interesting elements of the survey response, just to start looking at the differences in capability all around the world. I think this may wind up being a dimension that Fareed Zakaria talks about with respect to various global trends. But I found found these responses to be striking. And to start off with, maybe this isn't surprising to you, but Asia is the territory around the world where we're seeing by far the strongest security capabilities. And the trend continues. So we measure a variety of security categories or capabilities, and I'll review a number of them with you across each of the territories. And for every single trend that we're showing here, and we're not showing all the trends, but for every single trend that we're showing on this particular slide, Asia showed a positive trend. Again, Asia is by far the best performing region in the world. Before I review just a couple of the results to demonstrate that, we gleaned through the data, through our analysis of the data, that many of almost 3/4 of the Asian respondents indicated that the increased risk environment that they face and have faced over the past years has really, in fact, fueled by the economic downturn, has elevated the role of the security function in the organization, which has led to increased focus on security strategy and execution. And that is borne out in the data, where we see a 40% increase comparing 2009 to 2011 in their perceptions of security spending over the next 12 months. We're 74% in our 2011 respondents expect to see security spending increases. We saw an 86% decrease, and it's a positive trend even though the numbers go down, in terms of their ability to define the number of security events that have occurred in the past 12 months. We see a 47% decrease around their ability to determine the source of incidents over the last 12 months. And another one just to pick on here, see a 16% increase in a number of different of the technology tools, but in particular having malicious code detection tools. So Asia, very, very strong performance. And I think strategically it puts the region in a much stronger position to take on all the security threats that I summarized earlier in the presentation. Generally, we're seeing bad news in North America, where we see North American-based organizations being generally reluctant to invest in security, and as a consequence, we're seeing degradation in defensive capabilities. So of the trends that we're reporting here in North America, only 3 of them are positive and 7 of them are negative. We are seeing just a general trend in North America around North American organizations being far less likely to champion security. And I'll review a couple of the 3 positives with you. We did see a 2 basis point increase on security spending, projections of security spending increasing over the next 12 months, and then a few around secure browsers and intrusion prevention tools. But all of the other categories that we're summarizing here, including having a security strategy in place, conducting due diligence on third parties handling personal data, and having secure remote access or VPN access, as well as a number of others, are negative. These trends are, I think, they're just hard to reconcile and are counterintuitive. Again, when we contrast what I suspect you'll hear from General Hayden with what we're seeing in our data. Moving on to Europe. Europe's not faring very well either, where we're seeing similar results to what we see in North America. Of the categories here that we reported, 8 of the particular categories, respective categories, show decreases, and 3 show increases. The reality is that the results in Europe are very similar to North America. One of the high-level trends that we saw in Europe is that Europe really lags the rest of the world in terms of having capabilities related to securing third-party business partnerships and third-party risks. One to highlight. Moving on, South America, also trending negatively. We saw security capabilities in South America described as generally eroding. We see from a trend perspective of the variables that we report here, 9 of them are negative trends, 2 of them are positive, some of them are striking. We see a 39% increase, which is a negative trend, in deferred maintenance, deciding we're just not going to do it now, we'll wait and see. 20% decrease in their self-described effectiveness of their information security program. One other one to pick on here, 24% decrease in security information management processes. So Asia is doing very well. North America, Europe, and South America are really beginning to erode from a security perspective. So we want to try and learn a little bit from the leaders. As you can recall at the outset, I talked about the fact that 43% of our respondents describe themselves as frontrunners, those that have a self-described strategy and an effective ability to implement in their strategy. In a few minutes, I will reveal our results, but let me just review with you a couple of the trends that we see among our definition of a leader. And I think this is very important. This is an area for you to think about when you are thinking about your own security programs. Well, number one, they have a strategy. They have an information security strategy, which you have to have a goal if you are going to be investing time, money, and energy in something. So you need to set a goal, an objective, and you need to move towards it. Doesn't mean that objective should remain static. In fact, it should adjust to accommodate changes in circumstances. But we saw that the true leaders had an information security strategy. They had a CISO that had connection to the top of the house. They had a CISO that reported either the CEO, the CFO, the chief operating officer, or to the general counsel. This is very important from a governance perspective because this is a trend away from seeing CISOs report to a CIO, where there is arguably perhaps a lack of independence. This also goes back to the survey results, where having connection to the senior-most levels of the organization can result in alignment with the security or with the business strategy, and certainly is more likely to lead to requests for funding being granted. Another characteristic, leading organizations are effective at measuring and reviewing their security capabilities, and they continuously measure and review security capabilities year over year. How on earth are you able to adjust your strategy or know where your tactical weaknesses are if you do not measure the effectiveness and test the effectiveness of your program? Again, this comes back to the optimism bias element here. How can you be truthful about your condition if you don't measure your condition? And the last characteristic is the leaders understood, they had great transparency into what type of security events have transpired in the past 12 months. In some cases, going back years. Again, this is about having a strategy and having capability and measuring performance and being able to measure and understand when you in fact have a breach. So again, 43% said that they were front runners. The reality is that only 13% of our survey respondents are front runners or leaders, based on the criteria that I just discussed. Many of the leaders who responded to the surveys were business executives or IT executives, and I'm sure you will not be surprised to know that most of our leaders came from Asia, where about almost 40% of our leaders were found. Maybe surprising based on my survey from a geographic perspective is that North America was the territory where there were the fewest leaders, at only 16%. And there was fair distribution across really all of the industries, but technology, industrial manufacturing, and financial services led the pack. I think that makes sense. One that surprised me is seeing aerospace and defense at only 2% of the leaders. That was a surprising conclusion. So a few more points about the leaders. In order to help you understand some of their capabilities and the benefits of being a leader in this space. The leaders across the board reported 15 to 25% higher capabilities in many of the important areas that we measured. So for example, talking about transparency, leaders were demonstrated or reported far fewer number of incidents per year than the balance of the groups, or about half. They have far different appreciation of the risks that their organizations face. Because they have better transparency into security events, they reported more data and mobile device exploitations than other groups. They had a vast, significant increase in the actual use of a chief security officer in the organization. All the leaders, as I mentioned in the previous slide, all the leaders had an information security strategy. All the leaders measured their security performance on a regular basis. 57% more of the leaders have dedicated security personnel, so there's much more use of dedicated security personnel to manage security in the organization. And they all have a much higher and deserve and real confidence in their security program in terms of its strategy and its execution capability. So, coming to the end here, the question is, what does this mean for you and for your business? Again, what we would hope that you would do is use this information to help you be honest in evaluating your security program. To the extent that it would be useful to you and helpful to you, and I'll flip to the next slide in a second, which has the URL of the survey. I would strongly encourage you to play with the survey data itself, so that you can look at the information and more closely calibrate it to your particular organization from an industry size or geography perspective. Please focus on information security strategy. If you don't have one, you really need to have one. If you have one, be sure to refine it. Think about some of the risks that we talked about here, some of the risks that we hear from, like we summarized from Fareed Zakaria and General Hayden. So, and react to them. Refine your strategy over time. So, and then there really are four just bullet point takeaways here. Please focus on leadership of your security organization. Focus on strategy. Learn from the leaders. Focus on aligning your security strategy with your business strategy slash your customer needs. One of the other really important trends that we're seeing in terms of effective CISOs or CISOs is that increasingly effective leaders of security organizations have business backgrounds, really understand the business, understand where the business is going, and then can match the various technical solutions or processes to meet the business needs. And again, that's one of the trends that we see coming out of the data out of Asia, where there's the strongest performance in the world. I do want to quickly mention that Gary Loveland and Mark Lavelle are the two PwC partners that are responsible for conducting this survey. They've been doing it as I mentioned, for 14 years. So there's an awful lot of knowledge that they have and that our firm has accumulated. And you can find this survey here at www.pwc.com/GISS 2012. Strongly encourage you to play with the data. And so with that, I will conclude. Again, sincere thanks for your time.
Yeah, we discussed a lot about how to handle the security, but is there any description of the source and the reason, either geographically or topographically?
All right, I want to make sure I understood your question. You're asking whether or not there's more detail around the source?
Why, what's the source with respect to why the attack is taking place? Is it for a commercial reason or is it for just terrorizing?
We did not ask specific questions to address why our clients believe that attacks occurred. I think that we know from our experience that attacks occur based on the type of information that sits inside an organization, as well as the organization's just overall security posture, as well as various geographic operations of location. So that is a dimension that we do not specifically address in this survey.
Is there any general input on the geographical source?
Yeah, we see attacks really ultimately emanating from three places: Asia, North America, and South America are our principal call them attack points. That does not, and what's challenging is that an attack that is described as emanating from those three organizations may not necessarily leverage infrastructure or attack infrastructure that's physically located in those locations. But that's generally where we see attacks coming from. And then maybe again the general will share some perspective related to that question in his speech as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Back what is that?
In section 3, the spending drought and the reported increase in spending over the next 12 months, were you able to include a priori whether the reported spending was due to optimism in the economy or fear of cyber attack, or a combination of the two?
Yeah, I don't think that it has anything to do with optimism in the economy, and I don't think that it has to do with fear of attack. I think it's actually it's the opposite. I think that really what we saw in terms of influencing spending behavior is pessimism about the economy or economic challenge, and companies making or organizations making decisions around risk just based on decreased wallet. And so, that's why I think one of the takeaways from the survey is that when we see an economic downturn, it's a leading indicator from a security spend perspective that we will see a decrease. So really, I think the question is, given what we're facing today globally in the U.S. and in Europe in particular, will we see a continued decrease in spend in territories where we're seeing very concerning patterns as demonstrated in the survey? We'll see in next year's survey, but the trend, again, the trend around security capability and spend is generally very negative, but for Asia.
In looking at the differences between the leaders and the non-leaders, can you characterize how they assess risk from both a probability of occurrence and then the consequence of that occurrence between the different market segments and the different geographic regions?
Hold on, I'm not sure. So you're asking me to comment on the leaders, their capabilities to measure risk across the. Say it again.
No, how they characterize risk, how they assess their risk based on the consequence of something happening and the probability of that happening. Do the market leaders vary in how they assess that risk?
I'm not sure that there was enough granularity in our survey questions to be able to define whether or not there were different or more effective tactics or techniques of measuring or monitoring risk. I mean, our questions are much more focused around: do you perform periodic assessments? Do you security vulnerability assessments? Do you perform risk assessments? And so what we saw in the leader population is very high response rates of yes and yes. And in fact, there's even some consistency going back in time where leaders have for years demonstrated that kind of continuous risk assessment or risk vetting process. We may be able to, and actually the more I think about it, we may be able to tease out a little bit more granularity, playing with the data and the questions to see if there are any other interesting or striking patterns from an industry perspective or from a geographic perspective. But again, I think that the reality is based on the survey and the questions as they're constructed in this year's survey. We don't have more granularity into the underlying techniques of the risk assessment process. Hope that helps. We'll go right here first, and then we'll go there.
Okay, when you said the weakest areas were mobile and social networking, was there any indication on why they're not focusing on those areas yet?
Well, what I said was that what we're seeing is very limited adoption or adjustment to policies and procedures to respond to the adoption of those types of device use or social media use. I think that the reason why is that what we see in the data is that the organizations that actually have a security strategy and a risk assessment capability are looking over the horizon and looking at the types of technologies that the infrastructure is leveraging or their employees are leveraging. And so when these organizations see mobile device and social media use and adoption, or you have a CISO that's or a security capability that's aware, they have an effective mechanism of going into the governance structure and into the policy structure and actually changing or altering their policies and procedures to accommodate the new technology uses. So this is much more about having a virtuous cycle of capability than anything. And again, you see those kinds of characteristics in leaders that periodically assess and review the risks that they face and adjust their strategy and their policies and procedures accordingly.
Is Asia looking at this ahead of us, like everything?
Yeah, I mean, generally, Asia's adoption rates in terms of policies that address the use of bring your own device and the use of social media are far ahead of the other territories. And then there's another question right there.
So, from the survey, it seems interesting that although the security spending has gone up over the past couple of years, the security capability per se has gone down. So, what do you attribute that to? The increased number of vulnerabilities or more sophisticated attacks and
No, I think it's all those elements, but it's also perhaps a fascination on technologies and spending on technologies, and maybe not a fascination with integrating all the technologies in an effective way, and also not integrating an appreciation or realization of what the attack vectors are and how to combat them. And this is why, at this time, given the sophistication of the attacks, the continuous nature of the attacks, the seriousness of the attacks, we're really advocating that organizations step back and start to think about measuring these kinds of risks and using the infrastructure in a very, very different way. I mean, I think fundamentally, my advice to any organization today is to start thinking much more about the types of sensitive information that exists within the organization, maybe stratifying the types of sensitive information that exists within the organization, and perhaps managing that truly sensitive information differently from the non-sensitive information. And I do mean things like business plans, I do mean emails among senior executives, I do mean analysis of strategic spend going forward, as well as all of the sensitive customer information. And so, I think that's an incredibly important question. I think there's huge opportunity to just reevaluate sensitive information. Again, looking at the information from a different lens and maybe re-architecting certain sensitive business processes differently than in the past. Yeah.
And I completely agree with that approach. It seems like an awful lot of breaches, data breaches recently have been either SQL injection or lack of physical security, where it's leaving a laptop or a backup tape or a USB drive somewhere. And I know that there's a lot of threats that aren't as advertised in the public domain, but I wonder if companies at large are focusing a little too much on the more esoteric stuff and not going back to the fundamentals. I mean, we've known about SQL injection since 1998, and still security companies are getting into SQL injection attacks.
Having an effective security capability should span the continuum, from the simple to the sophisticated. And I think you're right. Maybe this ties to the previous question. Maybe there's been far too much focus on fancy technologies, intrusion prevention, intrusion detection, various types of host protection and prevention and detection systems, as opposed to going back to the fundamentals. And that's where, again, one of the characteristics of a leader is performing periodic security and vulnerability assessments. I mean, a SQL injection should be able to be a system that's vulnerable, should be very easy to identify and rectify. The other is, and I talked about it when I was walking through the data, the fact that we're seeing decreases in effort and expenditure just around fundamental things like training and awareness. I mean, so you talked about USB-based vulnerabilities being brought in an organization. Well, what better way to extinguish that risk than make sure that every single employee understands the risk? You don't have to worry about necessarily deactivating a USB port if you have smart employees. Now, that does not eliminate the risk of a malintentioned insider conducting an effective sensitive data theft or implementing a compromise, which is where you really need to again start thinking about understanding your sensitive data, who has access to it, and even ensuring that you have very strong logging and monitoring, so that in the event something bad happens, you have some evidence to be able to go back to try to figure out what happened. So I think that's another great question.
Do you have any data on what is the trend for cost of IT security tools? Suppose what is $1 million buying today, what kind of capability versus what it would have bought 3 years ago, and what we expect to spend in 2012? Is it going to go up, down?
Yeah, I don't have that data handy. That's something I can I can capture by one of my colleagues that focuses more on the spend side. So I'm sorry, I just don't have a good answer for you. Okay. All right. Well, thank you again.
For that interesting presentation. As he pointed out, there's a website that he encouraged you to go to, and if you have any questions, there's Frank and David and Gary are around, will be around for a few more minutes. Now we start for the first break of the morning. We will start promptly at 10 o'clock with Mr. Zachary. Okay, 10 o'clock promptly. Enjoy the break.